thank you, Dr. Bikman, for being here. And as a way of introduction, right, here with Professor Bikman, came down from BYU to have this conversation with us. Many of the distributors need no introduction for Ben, but are avid listeners of his work, and just really grateful that you take the time today.
Oh, my pleasure, Sam. Thanks so much for inviting me.
And really, I mean, what we want to get into today, you recently spoke for us in Las Vegas and shared some super applicable wisdom in terms of things that are happening in current events these days in the pharma industry and also within Unicity that we wanted to touch on. But before we get to that topic, you recently posted on X and Instagram some comments about a pretty inflammatory study that was released. And I've just noticed that, I mean, lately it seems like every few months there's a new clickbait article that comes out that's, Fruit Loops are more healthy than eggs, or in this one, 91% increased risk of heart disease by time restricted eating. So I'd love if you could, using this latest article, kind of break down and give us a case study to help people understand how they can guide themselves and what to pay attention to and what to ignore.
Yeah. I'll answer that question in two parts. One, I'll address that particular headline, and then provide my sort of commentary on the general view of mainstream media and the what gets attention. So the first part of it with the study, so that was the claim as you articulated. The headline was, intermittent fasting increases the risk of heart disease death by 91%. And so let's be clear, what they're claiming in this headline is that if you engage in intermittent fasting, and I'll define that how they did in just a moment, you basically have a twice as likely chance of dying from heart disease. Not getting it, but dying. That was the claim. In fact, right there on the media page of the American Heart Association, in big black and white, intermittent fasting basically doubles your risk of heart disease death. Now, first of all, let's go into this. The actual evidence was a scientist presenting at a scientific meeting. So normally, you would expect that if media outlets are going to start trumpeting up these scientific claims, that it's going to be based on data that has undergone peer review. That is the standard of science. If I'm going to share work from my lab, I can only get it published if other scientists have reviewed it and validated and confirmed my findings. Basically saying what Dr. Bikman's lab is stating here is justified based on what they did in the work. That didn't happen. This was work presented at a scientific meeting. I have students that go present all kinds of stuff at scientific meetings. None of it is peer reviewed. It's always just intended to be basically like a, hey, look what we're doing in my lab kind of thing. But even beyond that, so one, it was not peer reviewed. These are unpublished results. But if you actually scratch beneath the surface and look at the techniques here, then the whole thing even gets flimsier. For example, the way they actually tracked the data, it was a questionnaire that they gave someone asking them to recall what they ate the day before and when they ate it. And they found that if people reported eating within an 8-hour or less window, as opposed to people reporting eating in a 12 to 16-hour window, then those are the people who appeared to have a twice as likely risk of dying from heart disease as they looked in this same population 20 years later. So you can see just how many moving parts there are and them trying to string this together. All of this is what's called correlational data. For me, I do what's called causative data. I'm actually doing an experiment and then I see what happens. And so I can directly claim A caused B because when I did A, B happened. What they're doing here is, handing out a questionnaire, asking people what they ate yesterday, and then coming back to that same area 20 years later and saying, oh, look, those people who answered this way died twice as likely. Who knows? There are so many confounders that could have introduced this. For example, on that one day, what if those people who only had time to eat one meal a day were the same people whose jobs have them working 16-hour days? Of course you're going to have a higher chance of dying. There are just so many confounding variables. And moreover, the other group eating in a 12 to 16-hour window, who on earth is eating in a 16-hour window? Just at a glance, you can just start to see how silly these claims are. And especially when you compare this to other studies that have looked at fasting, There are so many known benefits that happen from clinical, well-controlled clinical studies. Intermittent fasting improves every single predictive value of every marker of heart disease gets better. Insulin levels come down, cholesterol, lipid levels improve, weight loss occurs, blood pressure comes down. If every single risk factor is dropping, how on earth can we then say that the risk of dying from heart disease has somehow magically doubled? It hasn't doubled. This is just some bizarre twisting of the data to tell a story. So that addresses that particular headline. But then the deeper issue is, I think, the more relevant one, which is how can we, as just citizens, navigate the claims that are made in mainstream media and use that as a bit of a guide? How can that be our compass or our North Star to give us guiding principles for how to live a life and nutritional ideas? At the risk of sounding very, very cynical, if you look, and this does, I admit, sound very cynical, but I think it's justified. If you look at who spends the most on advertising dollars on mainstream media platforms, it is drug companies. They are by far the largest payer of airtime. And so these mainstream media outlets, in fact, have a conflict of interest to say a story one way. So the ultimate cynical cherry on the top of my long answer to this is you can almost always do the exact opposite of what you're hearing in mainstream media, knowing that by ignoring what you're hearing in the media, you're probably going to be doing something that is going to make you so healthy that you're not going to be giving money to whatever the vested interest may be in promoting whatever that particular story is. Whether it's fasting, don't believe the hype. Fasting is absolutely healthy. Whether it is something like meat, don't believe the hype. Meat can be an exceptionally healthy part of the diet. And whatever else it may be, don't believe the hype. In general, the truth is going to be somewhere in the middle, and in some instances like this, it's going to be on the exact opposite end.
Yeah, I mean, the way that the economy of social media works, it really just incentivizes the crazier things. And that's, that's part of a larger social issue that I think we're seeing in a lot of places. But one thing I've noticed is something that seems like a positive side effect of the hyperbole that we see in these studies is that more people are waking up, right? They're having that red pill moment where they're starting to pay attention and be like, maybe these agencies don't have my best interests at heart. And that's leading them to more credible sources like yourself, like Dr. Fung, like so many out there who are putting out really credible, causative studies to guide people on like, hey, here's some real advice that you can internalize. And so, I mean, if you were talking to someone who is just starting to notice, they see this latest study and they're like, that doesn't make sense. And they start to pay attention. How would you explain to them like how we got to where we are today in this situation where now we've got people who are, the craze is to inject yourself weekly with this, synthetic drug to lose weight. And that's like the answer for weight loss. Like, how do we go from where we were 50 years ago to this situation now?
I think a lot of it is this, the ever-growing pursuit of financial gain, that there is little money to be made in good health. There's less money to be made in good health. That if someone shrugs off the conventional thinking of eating 6 to 8 times a day, eating in a 12 to 16 hour time window, eating primarily carbohydrates, 70% of the global calories are coming from carbohydrates, most of them being from refined starches and sugars, and whatever other advice, it is almost a culture of do whatever you want and don't worry about the consequence because we have a pill for that. That's kind of the culture that's being embraced. The old-fashioned ideas of you reap what you sow are being increasingly challenged and ignored or outright insulted. That the idea, even the very idea of, you'll see headlines now claiming that working out and being healthy is part of like another sort of political agenda. And I don't want to invoke politics here to make it complicated, but how ridiculous is that? So I really do think at the heart of it could be this idea of don't worry, we got the consequences covered for you. Do whatever you'd like. We'll make sure that it ends up okay. That is wrong. I as just an individual, as a father, husband, as a scientist, I reject that idea. We very much True success in life comes from learning to control your choices such that the consequences that come from those choices are the consequences you want. That is the key to happiness. And that requires a little bit of discomfort. It requires quieting the voice in your head, that natural pull to indulge in something when there's the other part of you that says, but you're going to regret it. So don't do it. And the world will say, indulge. Don't ever deny yourself any pleasure. But there's another part of the human that knows, I'm not going to like that consequence. That's the voice we have to listen to. So rather than eat whatever you'd like whenever you want and then just inject yourself with this drug, there's a more fundamental process. But even still the truth. So if that drug, for example, not to shift the topic too much, but to evolve into it, if that drug is going to say, hey, your intestines are capable of making a hormone called GLP-1, and if you have elevated levels of GLP-1, the evidence shows that you're going to generally be leaner and have a reduced risk of diabetes, because that's what it shows. And that is really relevant and not talked about. If you compare overweight versus lean, diabetic versus non-diabetic, some people have stated that perhaps diabetes and overweight disorders or struggling with obesity is a deficiency of GLP-1. So if we can increase GLP-1, maybe we can start to correct that a little bit. And so rather than injecting yourself with this, because there are consequences, when you turn GLP-1 signaling in the body up to an 11 on a scale of 1 to 10, which is kind of what you're doing with those drugs, there are consequences, the most serious of which is that you can paralyze your intestines. That's one of the main mechanisms of action, where you inject it, you boost GLP-1 through the roof, the intestines can just stop moving food. And then of course you're going to start eating less because you just feel really sick. So there's a middle there. There's a middle ground that we say, if GLP-1 is good, what can we do to increase that? And there are ways to manipulate your macronutrients, like focusing more on fat, but then there are ways to kind of boost that. Like, for example, the compounds found in Unimate with yerba mate. It is enriched with molecules that are known as they flow through the intestines to stimulate what's called the L cells of the body. And by turning the L cells on in the intestine, you start boosting your GLP-1 levels on its own. So if GLP-1 is good, rather than just saying, I'm going to eat whatever I want and then just take advantage of it, find metabolic forgiveness by spiking my GLP-1 through the roof. No, have a little bit of discipline, roll up your sleeves and get the work done, but still take advantage of what we know. I'm not saying ignore science and ignore these discoveries. No, but take advantage of them in a more natural way that's going to use your body's own system to work in your favor.
Yeah. So going back to that with GLP-1, I mean, thankfully, in a sense, some of the big pharmaceutical companies are doing a great job of educating people about the benefits of GLP-1, right? They're spreading that news. Everyone should be getting more of this and use our way of doing it.
Yeah.
But there's obviously, it's a natural thing in the body already. And then there's natural sources we can use to help our body to make more of it, like you said with Unimate. But I'm curious more of the relationship also with GLP-1 and your main field of study, which is insulin, and how those factors of more GLP-1 relates to the greater insulin resistance versus sensitivity.
Oh yeah, I'd be happy to talk about that. Yeah, so when GLP-1 drugs when GLP-1 itself was first discovered, it's actually a fascinating history that I've alluded to previously, but we discovered GLP-1 looking at the blood of people who'd just undergone substantial gastric bypass surgeries, commonly called bariatric surgeries, or just replumbing of the guts.
Yeah.
We found that all of a sudden there was this signal that just went through the roof in the blood, and we didn't know what it was, called it GLP-1. So GLP-1 has myriad effects throughout the body, all of which are metabolically favorable. The one that is taken advantage of the most nowadays at these very high doses is the slowing of the intestines. As you slow the intestines, you will eat less. But even long before you get to that level of effect, GLP-1 will inhibit insulin's opposite, which is glucagon. And that is very important in someone with diabetes, because diabetes is just as much a problem of too much glucagon as it is a problem of insulin not working well, and this is type 2 diabetes. So normally, insulin will be released and it will tell the alpha cells to make less glucagon and thereby help blood sugar levels come down to normal. But as the alpha cells that make glucagon become insulin resistant, now they are producing too much glucagon. So GLP-1's first known effect was to lower glucagon. And by lowering glucagon, blood sugar levels stabilize, and if blood sugar levels stabilize, then insulin can stabilize and come down. There is a myth within the common understanding, even deeper than common understanding of GLP-1, that GLP-1 is an insulin secretagogue. In other words, there's this idea that that GLP-1 will push insulin secretion. That has been shown to happen in cell cultures. If we were growing cells in a petri dish and put on GLP-1, then the beta cells would produce more insulin. But in humans, the evidence shows that it does not happen. There is no insulin secreting effect from GLP-1. In fact, Professor Arne Ostrup in Copenhagen found that when he was giving GLP-1 analogs to healthy people, their insulin secretion went down. And that could be because it was inhibiting glucagon, so there was less need for insulin to work. And adding to all of this is the effect of GLP-1 directly on fat cells. GLP-1 stimulates fat burning. And if you can burn more fat, you can shrink fat cells. And overly large fat cells are the primary driver of chronic insulin resistance. So from almost top to bottom, if GLP-1 can be boosted, it's going to improve insulin sensitivity through, again, myriad mechanisms, by regulating blood sugar, by helping shrink fat cells, by controlling appetite, all of which in combined will result in an improved metabolic milieu within the body.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I mean, I think that because, pharmaceuticals have identified that the weight loss market is where the real money is for these drugs, that's been GLP-1 equals weight loss.
Yep.
But understanding there's so much more going on that relates to insulin resistance and all the other plights that come with insulin resistance. I don't think that's touched on. I don't think people are aware of just how much benefit boosting their GLP-1 is actually giving their overall metabolic health.
Yeah, I mean, well said, Sam. All I would add to that is just a kind of hearty amen. One of the reasons I beat that drum so loudly of insulin resistance is just because of, one, how prevalent the problem is. Within the United States, potentially up to 88% of people have some degree of insulin resistance. That's mind-blowing. And as bad as it is here, it's even worse in various areas around the world. So one, it's just how prevalent the problem is, and then two, how relevant the problem is, which is, as you alluded to, every single chronic disease is in some way impacted by insulin resistance. Whether insulin resistance is directly causing the problem or it's exacerbating the problem, nevertheless, there's this one common core that even though you take something like heart disease and diabetes and infertility and migraine headaches, they each have individual contributing causes. But if you can say that there's one thing, that there's a thread from all of them to one common thing, well, then address that one common thing and improve all of those outcomes. And that one thing is insulin resistance. If it weren't so relevant, I wouldn't have devoted my career to it. And as I've said before, the opportunity of taking these ideas out of the classroom and having a bigger classroom like you and I are giving right now is thrilling to a professor. If you think you have an important message, all you want to do is share it with as many people who will listen.
Yeah, it's thrilling for me. It's thrilling for all of us because there's so many people that are hungry for what is this one thing. Right? We don't have time to pay attention to every single piece of advice, and so if I can only focus on changing one core thing, what should that be?
Yep. And
getting that direction is so helpful. So a couple weeks ago in Vegas, you touched a lot on the incretin effect. And so I'd love for you to expound on, what is that and how does that relate to this GLP-1 and also gastric bypass and the semaglutides and how those all are influencing that.
Yeah. So what I called the incretin effect in that talk was my way of introducing this concept of the endocrinology of the intestines. So once upon a time, like when I first studied endocrinology as a graduate student 20 some years ago, the class only covered these canonical endocrine glands, the thyroid gland, the adrenal gland, the gonads, the testes or the ovaries, and the pancreas, just these really famous poster child glands that secrete hormones into the body. But now we know that virtually every single organ in the body is an endocrine gland. The heart releases hormones, the liver releases hormones, the skin releases hormones, and so too do the guts, the intestines. And in fact, the intestines release a lot of hormones. Some of them fall into this category called incretin. And to be included in that family, this has to be a hormone that in some way has been shown to influence metabolic function in a general sense. And so that's what I call the incretin effect, that the intestines are known to release these hormones that have, on average, very favorable metabolic effects. Basically, if you've stimulated the guts to release these hormones, the guts they've been told, or they're telling the body, hey, energy is coming, use the energy. Because the guts are going to be the first ones to know that there's something coming, that it's about to come to the rest of the body. And so the gut is kind of the canary in the coal mine. It is the earliest signal to the rest of the body saying, hey, there's something coming, get ready for it, and I want you to store it or I want you to burn it, or do whatever else with it. And so the incretins are basically the gut's way of signaling to the body, hey, we have some nutrients coming and I want you to burn them. Let's kind of start stoking the furnaces and really ramp up the body and get it ready to do some work. That's kind of what the incretin effect is. And so it is something we want to take advantage of. And the most famous of the incretins, of these gut-derived hormones that control metabolic function, is GLP-1. That's why I have focused and why drug companies focus on it so much. Because any of the other incretins have a more modest effect. But there are a lot more of them. Some that I introduced in that venue was one called cholecystokinin, CCK. CCK has some redundant effects. It stimulates fat burning. It slows the movement of food through the intestines to help with appetite. We talked about another one. Another one is called GIP, gastric inhibitory peptide, which also has similar effects to GLP-1, stimulating better glucose control, for example, stimulating fat burning. The stimulating fat burning is kind of always a common one.
Yeah.
And then there's a handful of other ones. But again, the theme of them is generally going to be a greater improvement in blood glucose control, greater fat burning, all of which is going to result in generally improved insulin sensitivity.
And, right, so we have these ways that people are trying to get this, right? There's gastric bypass surgeries, there's semaglutide drugs, and there's, natural sources that boost production like Unimate.
Yep.
I mean, how do each of these work differently within the body in terms of, getting us results of what we want, and then long term, what's going to happen?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the first ones you mentioned, so if I were to put them on a scale of 1 to 10, how effective are they going to be at activating GLP-1 effects? The semaglutide, the GLP-1 agonist drugs are like an 11. I mean, it really is the super physiological effect. You've turned it up too high.
Yeah, the anabolic steroid.
Yeah, I mean, really is kind of the analogous to like you've juiced up in order to promote muscle growth. And it will work. Boy, will it ever work. Now, the problem, however, is that just like if you were at a rock concert and you're standing right up to the speaker, eventually you're going to stop hearing it because you go deaf. There's a consequence to turning that system up to an 11. The main one being you're going to lose so much weight so quickly through this almost starvation state that 40% of the weight loss on these drugs comes from lean mass. 40%, this was a published report in the New England Journal, 40% is lean mass. The problem with that is, with that substantial drop, 40% of it being lean mass, muscle and bone, when you get off that drug or the cravings start to return, which they do after about 2 years, remember, you've not really learned how to control your cravings. The drug has forced you to control the cravings. And so it's no surprise that they start to come back. And again, that's been shown to happen at about year 2. Then the person starts eating normally again, the weight starts to come back. As the weight comes back, we're made of 2 different types of weight, fat mass and fat-free mass. One of those comes back more readily than the other, namely the fat mass. And that lean mass, the fat-free mass, depending on the age and the sex of the person, if we're talking about a 60-year-old woman, she will never gain that lean mass back. That muscle and that bone is gone for good. And so as she has rebounded and is now gaining her fat back, at the end of it all, by the time she starts to plateau, she will be fatter as a percent than she was before she ever started. So the consequence with the GLP-1 agonist drugs is that it is just way too much of a good thing, and the dose makes the poison, if you will, and you have gone too far. Now, somewhere in the middle is the gastric bypass. Gastric bypass will increase GLP-1, actually probably to a level you could still reach on your own, because it is you still making it on your own. The problem with that is it's, once again, a forced control of cravings. You're forcing this person to eat only what can fit in this small of a stomach until they start to push against the stomach and it starts to grow back. They can basically stretch the stomach to grow back to the original size, because the intestines are very what's called dynamic tissues. And so once again, you sort of, if on that scale of 1 to 10, maybe you've got an 8 or a 9.
Yeah.
You're going to take advantage of the incretins, but the main effect is you're sort of forcing this starvation because of how you've replumbed the intestines. Then when you start talking about endogenous stimulation through Unimate, then you're probably a 6 or a 7. But the benefit there is that it is going to be a less dramatic effect, but far more long-term benefit, because the further benefits come into play here. And this is something you can take forever. The long-term consequences, we already know how bad GLP-1 agonists can be after just a couple years. The side effects begin really rearing their ugly head. There is no side effect to Unimate other than you're going to continue to feel good. You know, no negative side effect. And so lest someone think I am incriminating Unimate as its GLP-1 effect is not quite as substantial, you have to remember that there are other benefits here, and I've talked about these. I've elaborated these other benefits. There are other molecules that have their own effects at controlling cravings and regulating appetite. It's just more subtle, which I think is good. Back to what we talked about earlier, there's a benefit in getting a little help where you still have to do some of your own work, because that is going to make you, that is you reaping what you sow. This is you putting in the effort because you want that consequence and you know it's worth it.
Yeah.
And so you're willing to push a little bit and get a little stronger, more capable emotionally, intellectually, and then be in a better position to take control of your own health. So more of it, a little more of it's relying on your own help, if you will. This is just a little bit of a springboard to kind of accelerate it. You just have better sneakers on to run the race, rather than shortening the track, for example, in the other instances when you're just kind of cheating and you're not actually getting better, faster, stronger. In this case, you are getting better, faster, stronger in your habits. You're just getting a little help.
Yeah. I mean, hopefully no one wants to, deliberately they're saying, oh, I want to become more dependent on something.
That's right.
Right. I want to put myself in a situation where because of this and without this, I wouldn't be where I want. Right? Ideally, everyone's saying, okay, yeah, I'm open to getting help. I'd love a boost. I'd love a step up to get me where I can then be independent and be managing this. And that's, that's what we want to help, is how can we give you the aid to make the life choice to where now these life choices are just second nature. And you're living that healthy life.
I agree. That's where I'd like to think is where the sweet spot is, which is how can I enable you to take better control of your decisions? And then I've taught, that's that metaphor, I've taught you how to fish, rather than just this drug doing all the work for you.
Yeah. Well, what scares you the most about these semaglutide GLP-1 agonists?
Yeah, at a philosophical level, what scares me is the idea that you can do whatever you want without consequence. That is an idea that to my very core, I find very repelling. Independent of that, the main consequence is that you have people who truly have life-threatening paralysis of the intestines. And so what scares me on a more immediate level is just that you have unnaturally frozen your intestines, and you can develop what's called an ileus. That is the technical term for intestines that no longer move. Once that happens, you're dead within a matter of a day or two. So it requires immediate intervention, and you may then have to get surgeries to remove intestines. And then you're no longer able to have normal bowel habits, and your life is fundamentally changed. This has happened. There are reports of this already with these drugs. And so my worry is that people are leaning on these drugs way too heavily. That again, philosophical level, they're just learning how to cheat almost. And then at a more fundamental or physical immediate level, it is you're freezing your intestines and you want those to be working well.
Yeah. Seems like, just a small side effect that might happen.
Yeah, just life-threatening.
Don't read too much into it.
Yeah, freezing of your intestines. Yeah, I mean, things are supposed to move. But in fact, what's funny about them, funny in a sad sort of way, is that normally, if you and I were to eat a meal together, the food, we swallow it, goes down our esophagus, and it sits in our stomach, kind of getting churned around for about 4 hours or so. And then it starts to leak or seep down into the small intestine, where it undergoes more digestion and then ultimate absorption into the body. That's a normal timeline, 4-ish hours in the stomach. On these drugs, it slows the intestines down so much that you can have food staying in there for over 24 hours. And so this is the somewhat amusing part. There's something that people call it Ozempic burps, that they have this putrid breath. Putrid because it's like you're rotting food in your stomach. And so they're burping and just breathing out these noxious fumes as they have food that's just sitting there. And this was learned, we learned this was happening due to surgery. So normally if a person goes in for a general surgery and they have to go under general anesthesia to go unconscious during the surgery, they will typically be told to not eat anything for 24 hours, lest their stomach gets upset and they vomit during the surgery. And so normally they will just say fast for 24 hours and everything will be out, until people started taking these GLP-1 agonists. Now they have to tell people to get off their drug weeks before and fast for 48 hours or so in order to truly make sure the stomach is empty, because they had people coming in whose stomachs should have been empty and they weren't. Food is sticking there, staying there, and literally rotting, giving rise to this putrefaction coming up out of their breath.
It's wild.
It's wild.
There's so much. I saw an article from Wall Street Journal about how difficult it is for people to get off of these. And that's a whole other thing that's coming up. It's like, well, I wanted to lose weight, but now what do I do?
Yeah, they know. It almost is this metabolic handcuff, where they know the moment I get off this drug, that what's this so-called food noise that has been artificially dampened, these cravings that whisper at you to come and indulge and eat whatever, that people will say, I got on these drugs and then the food noise just went away. Basically, my brain has stopped buzzing, telling me to indulge in everything. But it was artificial. You didn't earn that control, because the true control comes from having the voice still there, but you learning how to have another voice that says, I'm not listening to you, because I know what's going to happen if I do that. That's kind of what I started with, this idea of discipline. The drug gave you an artificial discipline that will only last as long as you're on that drug. And there is this creeping worry that the person has, justified entirely. The moment I stop, all this quiet is gone and I'm right back into the noise, and I haven't learned how to deal with it. So we need to help people learn to deal with that little buzz, that craving, that little voice that's telling you to go and indulge and do something you don't want to. You need a way to have another voice that says, no, there's another way to do this. You know what to do. You have other tools on hand to help you combat this.
Yeah. And to be fair to a lot of people, in many cases these days, there's not a little voice telling them to indulge. It's screaming, shouting at them from every angle, every ad, TV, right? Their pantry, grocery store. And so that's...
And every addiction, of the 3 macronutrients, proteins, fats, and carbohydrates, humans have only been shown to crave one. And wouldn't you know it, it's the one that spikes insulin the most, and the more chronically insulin is being spiked, the more you're promoting insulin resistance. And of course, that's refined starches and sugars, carbs that come in bags and boxes with barcodes. No one is sitting around on a Saturday night thinking, oh man, I sure could use a plate of bacon and eggs. No one, it doesn't happen. You want something sweet and gooey or salty and crunchy, and that means it's going to spike your glucose up 3 or 4 times. It's going to spike your insulin 10 times, and it's going to be elevated for 4 or 6 hours, and you're going to feel sick. You're going to wonder why you did this when you know you didn't want to. We need a way to take that craving, and you're absolutely right. It is more often than not, it is not a quiet voice. That's why I have such empathy, because as I describe these things, I describe them in their simplest way, but I don't mean to imply that it's simple to do. Because when you start talking about habits, dare I say addictions, you're dealing with deep-seated things that are very difficult for people to control, but they can control. That's what they need to be told. Rather than, you can't control it, so just take this drug. What I think the message should be is, it's hard, it's going to require effort, but there are ways we can help. but you're going to learn how to control it. That should be the message.
Yeah, and that's our goal. That's the beauty of Feel Great as a program of these two products, these two tools that work to, on one side, take that shouting voice and all the distraction and turn it into a little voice that maybe it's still there. Sometimes it might go all the way in comparison to what it was before, and you might feel like it did go away. But it gives them a place where I feel empowered enough that I can make decisions. I can protect myself. And then you have the practice of intermittent fasting, trying to get on that 16-day schedule, which again, it puts guardrails along with the host of other benefits that you touched on.
The sooner we can get people to a point where they are able to listen to the other voice and have that voice become quieter, and it does get better, right? As loud as it seems to someone listening, as loud as that voice seems at the moment, it does get better. It gets easier and easier, just one day at a time. But yeah, I mean, the sooner that the Feel Great system allows someone to truly be looking at their day and their meal and their hunger and start making better choices, then it's worked. Then the sooner they've become kind of captain of their own metabolic vessel and they can dictate where it goes now.
And so one more thing you touched on, right? We've talked a lot about Unimate and that's shifting in the Unicity to become the dominant tool in Feel Great because of all we've learned about GLP-1 and what Unimate does with the natural production, along with everything else, right, that we'd studied before. And I mean, you can touch more on that because of the study that you did in your lab specifically with Unimate. But after, you share us a little bit about what you found with that.
Yeah.
And also, right, there's the other tool that has been the core of Unicity for the last 30 years of balance.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So nothing thrills a scientist more than being able to talk about his or her own data. So yeah, we did conduct a study in my own lab testing the metabolic effects of Unimate at a deeper level than has ever been tested before, which I can do as a basic scientist, as a scientist who actually goes to the level of the cell to study what's happening. I'm a cell biologist by training. So yeah, we looked at the group with Unimate in the drinking water and found at the end of this study multiple pretty substantial metabolic benefits. And I'll just highlight two in two different tissues, muscle and fat, because the results were so fascinating. What we found at the muscle was that the Unimate made the muscle mitochondria more efficient. So in the mitochondria, everyone knows, is the powerhouse of the cell. That is where it's taking in things like fats and glucose and burning it for energy for the cell to do work, like muscles contracting. And so again, the Unimate enhanced the efficiency. So for every bit of energy that the mitochondria were pulling in, they got more work out of it. So a perfect outcome. In contrast, what we found in the fat cell is that the opposite happened, that the fat cell became less efficient with its energy. Now, lest you think that's a problem, that's actually the most perfect adaptation, because the fat cell is designed to store energy. And if the fat cell were very, very efficient, it would only ever miserly want to hold on to all of its fat. We don't want that. We want our fat cells to be very giving. We don't want thrifty. We don't want frugal. We want very, very wasteful fat cells. We want fat cells that are just tossing their fat around to be burned, like a kid skipping down the street tossing pennies. So that's what we found. Not directly, of course, but we found that the fat cells had the mitochondria that were wasting energy for no good reason. They were just a little less efficient. So it's funny because you'll hear, I'm amused whenever I'm listening to the radio and I hear an ad for some supplement that makes your metabolism more efficient.
Yeah.
That is the last thing you want. You actually want a metabolism, at least in your fat cells, that is less efficient. Then it's just burning energy for no good reason. That's exactly what we found. And these animals were leaner. They were more resistant to weight gain than the other group that wasn't getting the Unimate. And then at the end of it all, so two very favorable adaptations at two very important metabolic tissues, the muscle and the fat. And then when we did one last test at the liver, we found that the liver was better at detoxifying, essentially, that its ability to handle oxidative stress, which it uses to clear out toxins from the body, was significantly improved with the Unimate drinking. And then after the fact, just for fun, we measured GLP-1 in this same Unimate group at a fasted state, which is so important. It's not like we did some big stimulus with GLP-1 or some drug, but the GLP-1 levels are about 60% higher. And remember, there's this idea that is obesity perhaps just a deficiency of GLP-1? Is diabetes a result of having too little GLP-1? Well, when the body was taking in Unimate, GLP-1 was higher at every single state, about 60%, a highly significant effect. So those were the results. And then with regards to balance, I mean, fiber rightly has sort of a hallowed place within the halls of nutrition science. And I have always supported the use of fiber when it particularly came to eating starches. That if you're going to be eating something that's going to spike your blood glucose, make sure you really get a lot of fiber with that. But over time, my view has become a little more nuanced, and GLP-1's a good example of why. As you take in fiber, it starts to get fermented through bacteria, which is a good thing. Bacteria in the intestines. And when the bacteria start to eat this fiber, they start releasing short-chain fatty acids. And short-chain fatty acids, they're small little molecules, but they punch above their weight class. They have substantial metabolic benefits at improving insulin sensitivity, stimulating the growth of new mitochondria, stimulating the production of ketones, which helps with appetite and themselves have anti-inflammatory effects. But at the heart of all of it is an activation of those same L cells of the small intestine that increase GLP-1. So it's fun to see these two components of the Feel Great system, each with their kind of distinct benefits, seeing that they actually converge on a couple points. One being GLP-1, and what a perfect time to realize this, as the world is becoming obsessed with it, with GLP-1 activation, and rightly so. It is a powerful metabolic signal that we want to take advantage of, but take advantage of it in a rational, thoughtful, controlled way. Let your own body make its own GLP-1 rather than this deafening signal that's going to have substantial side effects. Let this subtle signal work in your favor, and the effects will be a little slower, but far more long-term and far more just consequential as you've literally changed your life.
I love that explanation about with the metabolic efficiency. It reminds me of a great quote by Peter Drucker where he says, efficiency is doing things right, effectiveness is doing the right things.
Yeah.
Right? And it just talks about how through Unimate and balance, right, it's helping your body not necessarily be more efficient, right? Sometimes we want to be less, but focus on doing the right things.
Yeah, well said.
And it's really interesting because, I mean, the more as I'm branching out, right, to be learning from more people, anyone who's really doing their own research, doing the causative studies, is saying the same things. Like I've been reading through Metabolical by Dr. Robert Lustig. And right, his two big things are protect the liver, feed the gut. And you just touched on how, hey, through the function of the Unimate, we're protecting the liver.
Yep.
Through the function of balance, you're feeding the gut.
Yep, that's right.
And so add that with the fasting, and it's just this superpower. Dr. Ray, I forgot to ask you about another internal study you've done that was very interesting to me because I feel like a lot of the research that you put out there and the studies you do is helping people realize how to adopt what's natural, like what happens in nature, into their life patterns and eating patterns.
Yeah.
And so you recently, conducted an internal study with balance that brought us in that direction.
Right. So the old idea with balance had been that you take it before the meal. And that's certainly fine. I would want people to take balance whenever they feel most comfortable taking it. But the actual evidence found that when you take it with the meal, the reduction in glycemia was significantly better. So in other words, if you took it balanced 15 minutes before the meal, you'd have a glucose curve that may be peaked to here, for example. But when you took the balance with the meal, it was down by about 10-15%. Pretty significant. And so to your point, in nature, you wouldn't have eaten the fiber and then the sugars from the apple.
Yeah.
You'd have eaten the apple, and it would have been the sugars in the fruit with the fiber in the fruit. And so here again, we see sort of nature presenting the rational view, which is take it together, because that's how it would have come, and indeed the evidence supports that idea. So if people are able to and they're willing to make some adjustment in their habits, if they're taking balance as part of the Feel Great system, take it with the meal. Especially, I would suggest the meal with the highest composition of carbohydrates in that 1 or 2 times a day, and you're going to find that it's going to control your glucose levels much, much better than otherwise.
Yeah, I mean, the few people I've talked to about this so far, it's not even an adjustment, right? They're rejoicing.
Yep.
Because we know we're going to eat, but when you forget to eat before, like, oh, I missed that.
Right.
And now understanding that, like, oh, I didn't miss it. Actually, this is the perfect time.
Yeah, it's easier.
Yeah, it's easier. It's just the behavioral aspect is there. When you add in that scientific advantage, it's a huge deal. So thank you again for the time. I mean, for all of us in the Unicity universe, it's so important to have these sources who are doing really important science, understand these at a very, very deep level, but then can explain in a way that helps us articulate to our neighbors, right? To our friends who are struggling with insulin resistance. They're struggling with these same things, and they're wondering, what do I do next, right? Mm-hmm. Should I pay for these drugs? Will insurance pay for it? What else, right? It's just a matter of discipline. And so giving them a resource of like, hey, here's what to focus on. Here's how to keep it simple. Really empowers the thousands of people that will be watching this, tens of thousands, of how they can then make a real change in someone else. And so I'd encourage anyone to share these little tidbits that spoke to you and share those with people. Help them make a choice on, hey, here's what I can do to be healthier and that way happier in a month.
We really covered some important points. I will just say that I hope that people have remembered some of what we've talked about, particularly with regards to who to listen to, what voices that you're hearing, who you decide to ignore. But always wonder what someone's motivation is. And generally, you're going to come to a pretty rational conclusion on, is this something I want to do or not? Is this a voice I want to listen to? And my guarantee always is I will not say something unless I can cite studies in my mind and defend my perspective by showing peer-reviewed, published evidence. If I couldn't do that, I won't say it, or I'll admit that I'm speculating. So with all of the authorities, the one thing I can speak to with some authority is metabolism. Don't ask me to check your engine. Don't ask me to look at your air conditioner. But if you have questions about metabolic health, this is the kind of thing I can speak to with high authority. And it is my delight that someone like Unicity wants to hear from a guy like me.
We love to. Help to empower people to take care of themselves.
Love it.
So thank you, Ben.
My pleasure.
It's been my pleasure. And people can find you on Instagram and X.
Yep, that's right. Yep, InsulinIQ.com is sort of my little platform, but I'm wherever Unicity needs me to be. I love it.
Great, thank you.
Thanks.
For more information about these topics or to learn more about Unimate or balance, please visit youfeelgreat.com, where you can find that content and easily share that with loved ones who might need it. Thank you for listening.